Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, on Wednesday, Assistant Commissioner Neil Basu, who leads on counter-terrorism for the Metropolitan Police, revealed that of the 18 terror plots foiled in Britain since 2017, 4 were from the far right. And he said, a far-right drift into extreme right-wing terrorism is now a concern. Well, the government's anti-radicalisation scheme, Prevent, saw a 36% jump in extreme right-wing referrals between 2017 and 2018, rising from 968 to 1,312 cases. And last week, YouTube had to remove a 5-minute video promoting the far-right group Britain's First from its platform because it was judged to promote hatred, intolerance, discrimination. Should Britain be afraid of its far right? Well, Hifsa, working with... Where are I? Oh, there you go. Well, hello. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Working with Prevent. I mean, listen, these far right groups with a particular specific ideology, they come and they go. I remember we had Mosley in the 30s, the British Union movement, we had the National Front, we had the BNP. They all start arguing with each other and fracture, and it all fizzles out to nothing. No electoral clout. So what are you worried about?
I'm worried, and I think people should be worried. I grew up in the 1970s, and as a teenager in Leeds, I can remember the National Front being on my doorstep. I can remember the fear that it used to create when I was a teenager, when we used to see their street demonstrations. And excuse my language for using the word on the BBC, but I was a Paki. There was a constant reminder, whether I was in the school playground, on the streets, that you don't belong here, you are not one of us. And as a young person, you know, I had somebody trying to set fire to my hair, and it was a very visible threat in the 70s. We could see the National Front.
So with your work, because you do a lot of Islamist radicalisation, clearly, which is a huge concern in our country, with your work, are you seeing it's back and it's dangerous and it's threatening?
I think we've seen quite a shift.
It never went away, did it?
In the 70s, it was very much about somebody's race, somebody's skin colour. But the groups that we are seeing now, these new far-right, these populist street movements that are now, they're coming and they're going, but they seem to be coming, quite a lot at the minute. What we are seeing is that they are focusing on one particular community. Yes, you're absolutely right. We've seen the threat from Islamist ideologies in this country. The referrals that you referred to, there's almost a 50-50 split between Islamist referrals and far-right referrals, and we cannot ignore the fact that this is a growing threat. It's a toxic narrative that is aimed at one particular faith group, and it sort of blames 4 million Muslims.
Yeah, we'll get on to that. And I think one of the things that I'd like to also get onto is that, people in the liberal left agonise about what leads a young man to becoming a jihadist, what happened in his life to make him radicalised and to do something like he may have done, or to go somewhere like he may have gone. Do we spend enough time concentrating on these young men who end up in the far right?
I think we've got some academics, we've got lots of experts that are looking at these things currently, but what we do know is that these groups that we know are around are actually they're looking at, they actually use genuine concerns that people have in society. We know they use issues around migration, around grooming gangs, around the fear of terrorism. These are vulnerabilities that they exploit in young people who are genuinely frightened.
On that point, actually, because Professor James Treadwell, these are things that people are afraid to express, and there's a certain kind of disdain in some liberal quarters for working-class society, isn't there?
I think that's right, and in my book Rise of the Right with Steve Hall and Simon Winlow, we argue
Nicely
that.
done.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, and I think it's been a very sort of narrow and constrained debate in some way. We're talking about extremist groups, and there certainly are extremist groups like National Action that are emerging that we should be concerned about. But the drivers behind that are very often, in the first instance, they are economic. Whether we're talking about Islamist terrorism or we're talking about far-right terrorism, we can't disconnect that from wider things that are happening in the country.
Far-right terrorism is not driven by theocracy, is it? Desire for theocracy?
Well, I think it's driven in part by the fact, for example, we're entering into a United Kingdom where The United Nations are saying that by 2020, 40% of the youth population are going to be growing up in poverty, you know, and that's for one of the richest economies in the world. And what we're not necessarily doing is looking at the sorts of impacts that has. Now, in those communities where we've seen industrialised jobs stripped out, where nothing else has been left, I think there's been the political elites have been very, very slow to speak to those communities and to give them solutions. And the danger then is the people who will swoop in and who will give them solutions will be the extremists, and they will say it is because these people aren't listening to you and we have all the answers.
And it's that fear of globalisation.
It's partly playing
like
out.
Like corks on the sea, people feel. Should we be worried about this? Paul Jackson.
Yeah, I think so. I think the first thing to say is we need to kind of break down the word far right itself, because it's quite a big, ambiguous term. On the one hand, you might be talking about groups that are trying to be political parties and are actually pretty respectful towards the law. And on the other hand, you might be talking about terrorist groups. Yeah. So to talk to them all the time about the far right as being these things together is very problematic. I disagree with you a little bit that the terrorism element of the far right is driven by economic factors. I think that is driven by ideas, and some of them create neo-Nazi forms of faith, so in a way could be driven by a strange, ambiguous, cultic form of theocracy of sorts. So there's a sense of ideas running through the very extreme right.
It's not a global problem, though, is
it? No, but it motivates faith and an idea of a different type of white supremacist world motivates people much more than economic issues.
We need to get our terms right.
Yeah. But whereas if you're talking about, say, a street marching group like the English Defence League or something like that, then I think to explain its much larger significance in the past few years, then economic issues are more interesting.
But you've used some interesting terms on the way through, and we do, and I know you think this, we do have to be very, very careful about our terminology, because the phrase fascist is thrown about all over the place, isn't it? When people don't really mean this is somebody who believes in a strongly regimented economy and a strongly regimented society. So, okay, in your view, is Tommy Robinson a fascist?
No. I'd probably describe him as a far-right activist, perhaps even at times an extreme-right activist. But I wouldn't describe him as a fascist. In the historical literature, I'm a historian ultimately, we talk about fascism as being a revolutionary form of politics that wants to initiate a political and social revolution. So if you look at the Nazi regime in the 1930s, destroyed democracy, installed a one-party state, and then tried to occupy large parts of Europe and destroy whole, sort of identities like the Jewish community of Europe in total. So that's a fascist movement and a very good example of one.
A tight grip on the economy and on society. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And, fascist groups also take large elements from left-wing politics as well. So talking about them simply as being right-wing can be quite problematic too. But if you take people
economic
like Tommy,
intervention.
But if you talk about people like Tommy Robinson as being fascist, then I think that's quite problematic. But they are, very, radical part of the non-mainstream right, and they do play on some very similar fears.
Mike Killian, you've been fighting fascism for many years. Come back on that.
Actually, Tommy Robinson is a fascist. We need to be clear about that. He is the founder. He is the founder of the English Defence League that carried out a whole string of Islamophobic attacks before being pushed back by determined anti-racist campaigning. He is a former activist in the British National Party, or the British Nazi Party, as it should be called. And people like him, Anne-Marie Walters, and others right across Europe, unfortunately, Austria, Germany, France, we see the growth of the far right.
Isn't there danger that we cheapen the term fascist by lumping it with people just on the far right? Because there is a strict regimentation of the economy and the oppression of people and strict regimentation of society. That could actually apply to Islamism as well.
No, I think it's right. We do need to use the term.
So are Islamists fascist?
We do need to use the term selectively. And for example, UKIP is not a fascist party.
Are Islamists fascists?
There may be some. I wouldn't equate Islamism with fascism, but I think what you have to do is look at each party separately. UKIP, for instance, just to take an example, has been an electoral far-right party, but unfortunately, under Gerald Batten, is now leaning further towards the
So you think Anne-Marie's a fascist, do you?
I would say that parties like For Britain, a party that has former members of the BNP in it, former members of the National Front in it, is clearly an Islamophobic and fascist party.
But you have, Anne-Marie, can I just ask you, you have achieved something. You have achieved something extraordinary in that two former UKIP leaders, Paul Nuttall and Nigel Farage, have attacked you from the left for being too extreme.
Indeed, yes.
Well, they were enjoying being in the mainstream and they wanted somebody to pick on. They were tired of being picked on themselves and wanted somebody else. They wanted to divert that attention away from themselves and have someone
By saying you're too
apparently more extreme.
You're embarrassing.
No, the idea that this, this far right, I'm not convinced there is a rise of far right. What there is a rise, there is a far right, but it's small and it's not powerful. What there is a rise in is people being falsely labelled far right. Now, I come from the Labour Party. I said exactly the same things when I was in the Labour Party about Islam, about Sharia, about the horrible things that are happening to young girls all over this country. And we talk about exploiting this as if it's not real. What makes you think people are exploiting these concerns and aren't genuinely worried about them? My party, excuse me, my party is a democratic party, and anyone who has read any policies will know that we are not fascist. Our entire ethos is about empowering the citizen against the state. For example, we want a UK constitution to protect our freedom of speech, our civil rights against Parliament. That is not fascism. It's the opposite of fascism, and we're defamed consistently by people who haven't even bothered to read our manifesto. It's getting really... And the BBC does it as well.
Well, we're letting you speak now. So it's reported that you said, did you or did you not say, Islam is evil?
Why is that fascist? I saw an article...
Can I develop my point? If you said Islamism is evil, yeah. If you said jihadism is evil, but you said Islam is evil, what would you say to the decent, hard-working people who follow that faith in our country? And you could still look at the Old Testament, goodness me. There's problems in the Quran, there's problems in the Old Testament. What would you say to those people right now on television? You've said that Islam is evil. What would you say to them?
It's about definition. I don't consider Islam and Muslims to be the same thing. To me, Islam is the Quran and Muhammad. Muslims are individual human beings, each of them different. I thought I lived in post-Enlightenment Europe, where I was allowed to say whatever I liked about any religion. I thought that was my free speech, and I maintain that it is. Now, I'll tell you one thing. What the Quran says about me as a gay woman is far worse than anything I've said about the Quran.
Hifsa. Oh, some hands have all of a sudden sprung up. Hifsa. I'll come to those sprung up hands, if you'll pardon the rather gauche phrase. What about that phrase, Islam is evil but nothing against... Do you think that's whipping up people?
I think this is half the problem, and we had this sort of conversation about the terms that we use. By Anne-Marie's definition, and I am a Muslim, and I follow the religion of Islam. By that definition,
you spend your career fighting against Islamism and jihadism. I spend my entire career absolutely fighting against the evils of these people who have twisted and warped my faith and call themselves Muslims. I will continue to do that. But what people like Anne-Marie, I'm sorry, what they don't see is when they use these terms, they may understand what they mean, but somebody who's also looking at what's happening in the media and saying, we've got all these people coming into our country, we've got no jobs, we've got high unemployment, it's all because of these Muslims. These people have to be held responsible for their actions. Sorry, that's what happens. One more from Anne-Marie, then we'll go around the audience.
Can you explain what you mean by held to account, held responsible? What is it? You are essentially saying that you should set down the parameters of what I'm allowed to say about Islam. I refuse to accept that. I'm a free person in a democracy. I will say what I like about religion.
Absolutely, and
I will back it up with facts from the scripture.
You can back up scriptures as much as you like, but what you need to be looking at is the fact that we have nearly 4 million peace-abiding Muslims in this country, and your language is targeting them. We have got people in this country.
I had you in the first debate, so yes, sir.
Yes, I'm somewhat concerned about the contribution that lady has been making, trying to defend the BNP.
No, she wasn't defending the BNP.
Well, she tried her best. There's myself...
The British National Party are a Nazi party. Do you think she's a nut? Look, she wasn't defending the BNP.
UKIP, I don't see much of a difference.
You don't see much of a difference between UKIP and the BNP. This is a problem, isn't it?
That's exactly the problem.
Let me just say,
exactly the problem.
This is a problem. When you get somebody, when you get somebody saying there isn't any difference between UKIP and the BNP, that's where we have got a real problem of terminology, haven't we?
I think one of the things we ought to think about is how politics has become incredibly divisive, and labels are thrown out very, very quickly, which don't allow us to understand the complexities and the nuances of things. And in that climate, what happens is it's the extreme voices on either side that come to be the normalised ones. And for the rest of us, for the vast majority, that is incredibly problematic.
Any other hands which were going up? Yes, sir. Right at the back. Very quickly.
Yeah, I've been a trade unionist all my life, and all I want is the rights and the laws for people in this country. The right wing have constantly taken away the rights of working class people in this country, and there's a far bigger danger than the people you see demonstrating on the streets, and that's the rich billionaires who control the media in this country. Yeah, they will take away the rights of the working class people in this country. Ask the question, would they allow trade unions to go back to a closed shop or go back to a show of hands if you want to take industrial action?
Well,
then we'll find out where they come
manifesto
from.
3 elections ago were very supportive of some of the things that you're saying, ironically. Anyone? Yeah.
Do you know, with the whole Islam is evil, can I just say, if I was to stand and say all gays are evil, I could get arrested for that. So why is it then that she's allowed to say I don't wear a scarf, but I'm a Muslim. I don't go around preaching. So a Pakistani Muslim, brown skin person with a gun is a jihadist, is a terrorist. Let's run. A black man with a gun is a thug, is a criminal. But a white man is mentally distressed with a bad childhood.
Okay, but it's clearly, you're right, but it's clearly perfectly legitimate in our free society with our views and laws stretching back to the Enlightenment of free speech that we are entitled to criticise a religion. But it's quite different criticising people and hate speech against individuals. Yeah, your hand went up, yeah. Good morning, by the way.
Good morning. I was just going to say, it's really scary for me. I'm a psychologist, and listening to Anne-Marie there, it's terrifying for me, because I see the young people, and you don't realise the impact that she's so articulate in what she's saying, she's so passionate about what she's saying, and any vulnerable young person will follow that. The reason why my niece goes to a private school is because part of that reason is because she's black, because of inequality and because of racism, because we know there's so much racism in society that we have to make...
Is it more now? What's your name?
Gail, sorry.
Gail, is it more now racism in society? Are you picking it up? I'm sure you've experienced it all your life, but is it worse now than it has been for some time?
When I was a child, I wanted to scrub my skin off in primary school because it was black, because I was going to primary school in central Manchester, because of racism, because there were some local BNP people around the area. It's scary, and I don't think, Anne-Marie, please, I'm begging you, please think you are an articulate woman. Think about the power of your words. That you have. Because there are some very vulnerable, they're very vulnerable people.
Yes, there
and
are.
Young people.
There are vulnerable girls being gang raped in Rotherham still, and if we talk about it,
that's nothing to do with race. That's nothing to do with race.
Well, let me ask you something. If white men were targeting Muslim girls for rape and calling them Muslim whores the entire time, would it have something to do with race then?
Wait, Jimmy Savile didn't come from Karachi. Yeah, I mean, yes, there is a cultural problem there. Yes, it was shut up because of political correctness. Yes, it is something that the media haven't spoken about nearly enough because of fear of being called illiberal and racist. We've discussed it here, and that is the case. But there are ways and means, and there's language to use. Yeah.
I just want
What's
to
your
say,
name?
Michael.
I'm trying to keep it nice and friendly here. I'm Michael. How are you?
I just want to say, I am a Catholic. I came from a Muslim country. But what this lady just said is one of the most evil words I've ever heard in my life. That is so dangerous, man. That's so dangerous. If I get kids at home, we are on BBC right now. If the kids at home or any other person, even elders, are watching what this lady has just said...
Is it okay to say religion is evil?
No. No.
See?
It discriminates. Anybody who says Islam is evil.
You can't say religion in general is evil and bad for the world. You can't say that.
No, you can't, because how do you know it's evil?
Because
How do you know
that's
it's evil?
a point of view. You can look through history and see what role religion has played in history.
How
there was somebody else going to say something, and they were over there. Yeah, what would you like to say?
I think it's fair to say religion is evil. However, like referring to one, it's fair, but referring to one specific religion group, especially Islam, is highly emotive in terms of the fact that you have to take responsibility in terms of where do we draw the line between freedom of speech and hate speech? Because what you've said has generalized a big group of people, and especially people who live in Britain and call themselves British. When they subscribe to this religion as they're being termed as evil, is it being termed as they're not belonging here, or what do those connotations have?
I think it's the personalising of it that makes people feel threatened, rather than the general critique of the Quran, which is perfectly legitimate. Should we be worried?
I absolutely think we should be worried about the far right, but I think primarily, I mean, aside from its capacity to incite and propagate violence, it's really about what it tells us about where our society and our politics is at today. I mean, these are really quite cynical opportunists, and they're exploiting really profound social divisions and political dysfunction. And this is true not just in the UK, but right across the West.
Do they have a coherent political philosophy, or are they thugs?
I think there's a real spectrum, of course, on the far right, and I also come back to this point. I think we have been quite lazy in labelling far too many things the far right. Mainstream conservatism is not the far right.
UKIP, we had UKIP and BNP equated. Whatever you think of UKIP.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we need to be really careful about that, because extremism should not be a partisan issue, and this is where we're going. We're getting to this point where we're somehow creating a zero-sum game or a hierarchy between hard-left extremism, far-right extremism, Islamist extremism. They all should be of concern to us, and we should be attuned to all of them.
Yeah. What about anti-Semitism on the far left? How much of a problem? If so, how much of a problem do you think?
I think anti-Semitism is still quite a problem in this country generally. And I think we've moved on. You know, we've got anti-Semitism, we have anti-Muslim hate. You know, there was hate against Catholics in this country as well. And I just want to refer to the comment that you made, that Neil Basu made earlier this week, because in essence what he was saying was that these groups and these influencers, they've created this febrile atmosphere, you know, where this hatred has almost become the norm. And what they're doing, they are weaponizing these vulnerabilities that people in society have had. And those tools are then being picked up. And I actually feel quite sorry for the young people that are listening to this conversation, because they are the ones who are being radicalised. They are being pulled into this web.
Critical faculties.
Absolutely.
We've often had a politics of division, it seems to me, where what we're not talking about, and I think what we need to be talking about, is what brings people together. And all of this debate is playing out against... well, that doesn't necessarily bring people together, but it's a great illustration, Brexit, of how narrow our political debate has become, where a really complex issue becomes, on one side, you know, everybody who voted Leave is racist, through to, you know, it's incredibly complex. And the more that you have a politics that's about what people have that separates them and divides them off, the less you actually talk about what unites and brings us together. And a final point I'd just make, when I was talking about economics, you know, in this country we have seen rates of poverty, austerity, social services torn out of communities, lots of very disadvantaged and vulnerable people feeling frustrated and angry, at the same time as we've got 25 global elites who own half the world's wealth. And what we really ought to be doing, perhaps, is thinking about how we have a society that brings people back together.
And you were talking earlier on about the fears of globalisation and people feeling alienated and isolated. Hi.
Hi. I was at a meeting, and it was when Brexit first became there, and there were all women in the meeting, apart from the guy that was running it. And one of the questions was, what should happen? And the woman next to me said, get all these foreigners out of the country, we don't need them.
What did you say to her?
I said,
keep it clean.
Really? So are we sending all the doctors away as well? And she went, I said, you're talking about clearing all the foreigners out. That's the doctors. And she shut up then, so we can win.
Yeah. Morning.
Hello, my name's Molly.
Hi, Molly.
Hello, I'm a religions and theology student at Manchester. And about this question back to anti-Semitism and radicalisation of Islam, I think what the problem is, I think what we should be afraid at is how we are making religion political. And I think what you're doing, actually,
But people in religion are very often making religion political.
They are, but I feel like a lot of political parties, they use religion as a scapegoat, you know, for their own political gain. And I feel like what you're doing is you're creating a really dangerous foundation for what could be, like, racism to grow. And I think religion isn't evil, it's how it's used that's evil. And it's how political parties use that religion that is the problem.
But if you look through history, some would argue that it's had a very, very deleterious and negative influence. Yes, sir, yeah. You're Anne-Marie's, Ian, isn't it?
Yes.
Anne-Marie's press officer.
Yeah. The lady up there, Molly, to its core, Islam is a political system. So you're talking about things not being politicised. Islam is a political system. Since in this country, 7/7, Islam has delivered a horror show to this country. To the point when you say the terrorist attack, and you go, which one? Which one? Which Islamic terrorist attack was it?
Can I pick up that particular point? Hifsa, that kind of language, immediately when you talk about Islam, then within seconds stepping to 7/7. Is that what you're talking about?
And this is exactly the point. You know, you are associating, these atrocities, these disgraceful acts of terrorism committed by a handful of people, and you're basically saying these guys are exactly the same as the 4 million Muslims that are living in this country. These people are exactly the same as the family living next door to you.
And Paul Jackson, it's about terminology, isn't it? And when we hear somebody saying that UKIP and BNP are exactly the same thing, that's why we need to have our heads screwed on here.
Well, I think so. I mean, and the BNP is sort of something that comes from...
Are they still a thing?
Just about, sort of. But I mean, I just wanted to come back to this thing of language. I mean, I use in some of my work the word licence rather than, say, inciting. And I think, some of the comments we heard earlier on kind of really speak to this. There's a language, the way in which people are talked about in a very one-dimensional way. And if you read the material produced by Anne-Marie's party, you'll see that Muslims are talked about a lot, and they're talked about in a very one-dimensional way. And Anne-Marie, I'd give you a warning in the sense that Darren Osborne, who carried out a terrorist attack a little while ago, read heavily Tommy Robinson's writings that did a very similar thing. They talk about it in Muslim communities in a very one-dimensional way, and they create in people who do have their other vulnerabilities, sometimes their mental health vulnerabilities, to go back to the lady earlier on, that combine a sense of deep, deep frustration that's burning for quite a long time, and then there's just something that sparks them off, and they carry out
People can make their own interpretations of anything that they read. We just heard that earlier on from Hifsa, whether it's Tommy Robinson or whether it's a Holy Scripture.
But when the language is so powerful, so potent, so one-directed to talking about one group of communities...
Is it an obsession?
It's a licence to hate, is what it is, Nikki. And it's very dangerous.
Nikki, can I give you a quick example?
Sophia, what do we need to be doing here?
Well, I think if we see far-right extremism that is sort of really gaining a more prominent voice in our societies as a kind of canary in the coal mine for these much broader, deep-seated issues within our societies. I mean, I think it's important to take a step back and remember that, yes, we've got these opportunists sort of whipping up hatred, and obviously there can be really, really terrifying and violent ends to that.
Do you include the rhetoric of Donald Trump in this?
I think this cuts to this much bigger problem, which is actually that we're really shifting the needle on acceptable discourse and language and issues. And I think that reflects the fact that there has been a tendency, and we alluded to this before when we talked about Rotherham and so on, that when I do focus groups in Britain or right across Europe, there is a really strong sense across widespread groups of society that traditional politicians, the mainstream parties, have not been good enough at creating space for open debate about some of these contentious issues.
And addressing issues that need to be addressed.
Immigration, culture, identity, values, and so on. And what's happened in that silence is that we've created this huge vacuum. And I do focus groups with people talking about Tommy Robinson. They may think that 90% of what he's saying is completely ridiculous. They may think he's a thug and a lout, but they will increasingly defend his voice in the public sphere.
We have to leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.